The law is not for the people who respect it. The law is for people who violate it. And when you have impunity and no prosecution, then you give a powerful message of legitimacy. Leadership means going beyond rhetoric.
Just say no. Equality, justice, and hope for the true beneficiaries of our future, our children. So, Professor, with 40 years of experience in human rights and child protection, and a very eminent professor of law, what really drew you to the field of child protection at the beginning?
Well, I think as a lawyer, I was always interested in public law, constitutional law issues, rights, human rights specifically. And what started me off actually on this particular area is that I worked abroad, I came back, and then I confronted for the first time in my life a very sharp reality which I was not aware about, which was in the early 80s, a report on sexual exploitation of children in the beaches, southern beaches. That was it was shocking to read that report. And so there was a sense that there is a social issue here and you should look into it from a legal perspective. So through looking at it from a legal perspective, what does the law say about this horrendous phenomenon, then a colleague of mine and I did the first piece of research on child abuse. So that unraveled a whole range of legal, policy, community issues, and that's really what started me off on this area of looking into child rights. And of course, from there, another major issue was the exploitation of children in domestic service. That was a reality, but the viciousness of it came out later in those years, and there was terrible cases. So that, inspired a kind of need for activism, changing policy and law.
So interesting you say that, because to a greater extent now we have abolished children in child labor in homes, domestic helpers. Yet with so much of work being done and so many years, decades have gone through, it's come to the stage where a child is believed to be sexually molested every 2 hours in this paradise island at the moment. And we have now been issued with a red alert in 2018 by the United Nations Rights of the Child Committee. Why do you think things have got so bad, and what can the citizens do to help governance in the matter?
Well, from my experience, I think we've got to reflect on where our successors came. This country has had a long history of proactive legal policy, resource allocation interventions for children. And this is why in South Asia we stand out on social indicators in areas like health and education. Once child rights came, child protection took on. That was in 29, the CRC was ratified by Sri Lanka also, and that was the late 80s and early 90s. The last piece of legislation on children and child protection was 2006. So up to that time, there was engagement, political will, and leadership. And this is very important to impact. In countries like Sri Lanka, you cannot have, or it has never been the experience, that social movements can take on everything. They are supporters, they are partners, or should be partners, same with the community. So the leadership was there. Then there was also the commitment. Apart from leadership, there was institutional strengthening. And it was not accidental that in 1998, the National Child Protection Authority was recognized at the Yokohama Conference on Child Sexual Exploitation as a good practice of international and regional significance. We were recommended for that. So we had the NCPA, which was a high-level authority located in the President's office. And that authority also was an important institution, together of course with other institutions, the traditional ones like provision and childcare, etc. So we had institutions and we had resource allocation. And then the partnership with civil society. That was a key also, because the civil society never took on. NGOs have now, the concept of NGO has now become politically incorrect almost, and that's wrong. You need partnership from organizations with the state. So we had all those four. I'm sorry to say that in the last decade, all those have diminished. Leadership, we have seen, for example, the NCPA taken out of its status as a statutory authority, coming under the ministry, a state ministry, but at least we had a state ministry. Now we don't have that. It's under the Ministry of Education. So institutions. Then of course resource allocation, we know the budgetary cuts, and then the NGO, the civil society partnerships. Where are the partnerships with civil society organizations to carry forward these messages to the community?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, Professor, one of the recommendations as critical and urgently required to attend to during the 2018 UNCRC sessions was ending corporal punishment and violence against children. And their recommendations included one small amendment into the penal code, where we have said in our penal code, suffering, the word suffering is there, and they've suggested that we remove that, we've amended that. But to this date, nothing has been done. How, you know, surely it can't be a resource allocation issue there. So how difficult is it to make such simple amendments to the penal code?
Well, as I said, leadership and policy has to be from the state, the government. And let us take this issue of corporal punishment. There has been policy initiative in this country during the Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga government. Tara Dimel was the secretary, and actually there were many meetings on this whole issue of corporal punishments. I think one large meeting organized by Sarvodaya. And then it was decided that the schools must take an initiative, because a lot of the abuse starts in the school. Leave aside family, look at the corporal punishment means physical, the word corporal punishment in the law means physical punishment, not just discipline, physical punishment perpetrated inside. The fact of the matter is the institutional response has not been there. So what happened then was a guideline to schools to say don't use corporal punishment. And we, in fact, my husband appeared in a case where the child alleged corporal punishment is a violation of Article 11, inhuman and indecent. The court said yes. But that policy of guideline was never followed through with legal, regulatory changes, including, as you said, the changes to the penal code. Now, the reason for that is, I think, the lack of leadership from the state to follow up on what happened in 2000, I think those regulations on guidelines on corporal punishments must be in 2004.
2005 and then renewed in 2016.
Right. So when they were renewed in 16, it's no use having a guideline. There should be a policy change in the law, right? And that should be followed by the guideline which says this is a legal offense. Parents and teachers should know that. The child should know that. And then you try to create this culture of understanding that discipline is not using physical punishment, right? I was amazed at the number of policies on children that we have developed during the last 10 years. It's amazing. There's every area covered, and some of the best are from the Department of Probation and Child Care Services and from the Children's Secretariat. So there are all these bureaucrats who understand, who know, but what has happened? It has not been taken up at the level of political will. And so this is a gap. And why is that? Because unfortunately, when it comes to political will, there's a lot of rhetoric on children. We love our children, we believe in our children, but when it comes to taking on issues which are not perceived as politically correct, with some people saying, you know, spare the rod and spoil the child, those kind of conventional values, the sense is, oh, you know, these are things we shouldn't touch. So there is no political will in terms of understanding that this is crucial to create a culture of tolerance, respect for the dignity of a human being and a child, and the idea that the school must be a safe space for children.
Yes, and one might even go further and say, if I'm not mistaken, that a child does not have a vote, and therefore their rights, a child as a rights holder in our country is also not given priority.
Well, I think I have a different take on that. I don't think this is correct, because you see, historically we go back to a country which has had value for children. I mean, think of that Kaviya, Maavani Bilinda, Varavara Nangata Kenda, Duksapa Kumanda, Asara Nirindo, Venakoinda. And the British, the first colonials, expressed surprise at the way, they came from a Victorian background in England, and they said, you know, this country, this society teaches its children well. They too often spoil them with their kindness. You see, so there was this kind of view. And that is why, unlike any other country in South Asia, we gave education as a right, health as a right. So there was a recognition of the child as a human being going into adult life. So the child rights idea, when we ratified, you know, in when we ratified in 1992, it was all resonated with a kind of value system. It is, and that is why all those institutions also were put in place. But again, as I said, this change, significant change from 2009, even in the war years, armed conflict, sorry, I mean, I like to call it armed conflict, use of armed conflict. Elara Otunu, the UN Special Rapporteur, said, commended Sri Lanka for providing education and health, sharing budgets. I was in the University Grants Commission at that time. Our budgets were shared for education resources, and this was commended. So we had terrible violence also, but there were some positives. Now what we see in the post-armed once 2009 post-war years is a different scenario. And because of that different scenario, now we are getting comfortable with the idea that child rights is an alien Western discourse. And that's wrong. It was never an alien Western discourse. It has come into the public and space because with this ethno-nationalism, everything from the West, you know, is this hostile international community, failing to recognize that our leadership was because we are part of the international community. And we take our seat in the United Nations as a member state. So this ethno-nationalism has now, for the last 10 years, prevented us perceiving the realities. Then what happens? We reject this child rights is Western.
The fact that, you know, we had such a brilliant past and the love and the care that we had from our forefathers' time to the current time where you and I both tried to convince the current government when we lost our women's and children's ministry to the state, to downgrade it to a state ministry. It's sad that things have deteriorated on behalf of our children. And in many countries, with the legal system being reformed, they have introduced restorative justice as opposed to the punitive justice process that we practice, which is a very long, arduous process. What are your thoughts about the restorative justice process?
I mean, I think in a general sense, restorative justice is extremely important. That is very important. But I really think from my perspective on human rights, it's not an either or. You have to have justice through prosecution. It gives a powerful message. That's why justice through prosecution is a justice system must give a clear and loud message that impunity is not acceptable, it will not be tolerated. So therefore, there is a place for law, regulation, prosecution and punishment, but it has to be combined with restorative justice. So that those restorative justice concepts, victim-centered, compensation, rehabilitation, reintegration, all those are very valid. But to me, it's not an either or. And I think this is particularly relevant for Sri Lanka. Still there will be the gap, because the general, you see, the law is not for the people who respect it. The law is for people who violate it. And when you have impunity and no prosecution, then you give a powerful message of legitimacy. This is precisely what has happened on child abuse. You see, when a child gets beaten up we have a lot of media hype and publicity, sometimes press, but the press does not take on this issue sometimes, and should, of what do you do about it. And that was not so in the past. Do you know, there was one case in the 90s, 2000s, where an official was charged with abuse of a domestic, and the Attorney General didn't prosecute. And the judge said, I think the state is not prosecuting, I think they're withdrawing the prosecution, but I think there's a case to go. On the basis of that, child rights organizations lobbied. The Bar Association took it up, and the Attorney General had to reopen the prosecution. You see? So that is, in other words, a situation where you say impunity is not acceptable. So I don't think it's an either or.
Okay. That's very encouraging to hear that, especially as we have just celebrated 73 years of independence, and we sing in unison about having a better country for our children, talking about the future generation, but we end up getting a red alert, and we end up being the lowest 10% of countries that are safe in terms of violence against children globally now, with ever rising incidents of physical abuse in Sri Lanka. What is the one thing that you would like the government to do, and one thing that we as citizens can do to resolve the national child protection crisis?
Well, I would like to say that the government and the state should look back and reflect on our past experience and recognize that their leadership is crucial. Now, that leadership means going beyond rhetoric. The state has to recognize its commitments under the Constitution as is, and hopefully child rights will be included in a new draft of a new Constitution. So its commitments, and not to move from rhetoric to action on the basis of internalizing the need for this intervention is crucial for the well-being of your current generation and for the next, because it is a well-known, there's evidence-based research to say that an abused child, that impacts that personality, and it's enormously. So your adult will be affected by that experience. So you can't talk about future generations without linking the two. And for civil society, again, the government needs to respect the contribution of civil society and see it as a partner, because the government cannot also do everything. And they need, state institutions need partnerships with civil society. And rather than monitor them and aggressively undermine their very existence, they need to recognize from past experience that they can really contribute as partners to this effort.
We were in conversation with Emeritus Professor of Law, University of Colombo, Professor Savithri Gunasekara.